Hello again, I'm Harry Riley. Welcome to Harry's Tales. I enjoyed writing them and hope you enjoy them too. This one's called The Ghosts of Grimsdyke Hall. This story is fiction and resemblance to anyone living or dead is coincidental. Several years ago, my wife and I visited Grimsdyke Hall, a fine old house set in large grounds in one of England's glorious county shires. It's a pleasant, stately home that has been bequeathed to a national charity for the protection of country estates. We were there on this warm summer day as members of that organisation. It had been a long drive from home, and as the property was only open to visitors on certain days, here we were midweek and full of anticipation. Once through the tall wrought iron gates, we advanced slowly up the long winding drive, passing through the dark avenue of majestic oaks, originally planted in 1750. The grounds had been kept to their original style and were surrounded by many acres of open farmland with a few sheep and cows dotted about the landscape. A member of the aristocracy, the first Viscount Grimsdyke, had built this house, and it had been passed down through generations of the same family. The residence, of distinguished architecture, with tall octagonal chimneys and rows of classical windows, was built face onto the drive, no doubt to impress the coach-driven guests. Construction was of red brick and stucco, and had been extended considerably over the years, as each successive generation had stamped on its own personality. Just to the west wing of the house we observed the lake shimmering through the trees, imposing portico, and passed through the entrance doorway. A brightly painted signboard announced we'd arrived during a themed week, when all the staff would be dressed in period costume. This was evident when a gaily dressed milkmaid, in keeping with the adopted character she was enacting, did a pleasant little bob as she presented us with a leaflet containing a map of the grounds. The large hallway with its high vaulted ceiling possessed a fine oak panelling and ingle-nut fireplace with mellow limestone flags to the floor. A collection of flintlock muskets and officers' swords from the English Civil War period were positioned around the walls as though to be ready to repel raiders. The remaining wall space was taken up by paintings of the family members by old masters such as Van Dyck, Rubens and Rembrandt. We should have followed the visitors' tour arrows and gone right to the right and up the wide staircase to the first floor, but instead, being totally fascinated by our surroundings, we inadvertently wandered to the left, which should have been the final room to visit, and here we found ourselves in the lower drawing room. We were the only people here apart from the room guide. He was a rough-looking fellow, tall and with long straggly hair, standing almost out of view to the left of a large cabinet, and oddly enough was drinking claret from a crystal glass. We wondered if the staff were indulging in some private celebration, and felt quite guilty for intruding. This room, though exceedingly cold, was a revelation, as it had a more modern lived-in look. It was a long wide room, and the shiny black Steinbeck grand piano at the far end, facing out over the lawns from the shuttered sash windows, added a touch of elegance, and showed the musical interest of at least one member of this ancient family. Here the walls, apart from a long section of dark oak panelling, which seemed strangely out of place in such a bright and cheerful room, were papered in a light and airy style by William Morris, with long embroidered curtain drapes and fabrics. In this room the paintings were mainly landscapes by Turner and Constable, but the painting that attracted my attention was a large portrait of a very beautiful young woman. She was obviously one of the later inhabitants, and a close view of the small inscription beneath the painting showed her to be Lady Violet Grimsdyke. There was something very vibrant about her, and the artist had made her large eyes sparkle and seem incredibly real and alive. She was standing by an old beech tree in the centre of the painting, with the stables in the distance, facing the artist, and with a splendid chestnut mare just behind her. She was wearing a riding habit, a black felt top hat, white blouse and long dark skirt. The horse was equipped with a side saddle, and just to one side of the horse's head stood her groom, almost out of the scene, holding the reins, his swarthy features doing nothing to detract from the graceful elegance of the young woman. The lady had a pale complexion, her long brown hair being held in place by a snood, a sort of net. Her left hand, delicately raised up near the horse's head, possessed a ring with a huge, iridescent emerald set in gold. According to the gypsyish-looking room guide, who spoke in a country accent, and who incidentally bore a remarkable likeness to the young groom in the painting, the ring had belonged to the lady's grandmother, and was her favourite piece of jewellery which she always wore. As he spoke, in his peculiar voice, we studied him more closely. He seemed to suit this old-fashioned look, both in manner and dress. He had a large ramrod back, and wore a brown tweed hacking jacket white stock around his neck, riding breeches and boots. Without more ado he left us to our viewing and retreated back to his original position. As we progressed through the room I turned to look back at the lady in the picture, and was amazed to see her eyes appeared to be following me around the room. I remarked on this to my wife, and the guide overheard me saying, "It's just a trick of the light." The rest of the rooms were interesting, but of no special interest to this story. The walled gardens, though, were of exceptional beauty, and still cared for with a passion by a team of gardeners. After a very enjoyable tea in the restaurant, we both vowed another visit, perhaps during spring or autumn, would be well worthwhile. In the event, it was to be another 2 years before we did so, and it was a cool but sunny autumn day when we made our second pilgrimage to Grimsdyke Hall. Normally on the second visit we'd view the gardens only, but as this had been a long journey, we wished to make the most of it and to look around the house once again, to observe any changes. Also I was more than curious to revisit the portrait of the lady with the strangely alive and sparkling eyes. This time we followed the guide arrows and arrived at the lower drawing room at the end of the tour. Again there was only ourselves there, until we noticed the same groom sitting in a corner. This was rather surprising, because on this visit there had been no mention of another themed occasion. The portrait that had so captured my imagination was still in its earlier position, and I made a beeline for it. Only this time I was disappointed. The lady's eyes didn't follow me around, but gazed firm and straight over my shoulder. I did an about turn to follow her gaze, only to see she was staring straight through the large window and out over the lake, that was clearly visible and even nearer the house than depicted on the map. The groom stood up and remarked that, owing to woodworm, the dark panelling had to be removed for urgent renovation, and it was then discovered that the big window had been concealed. And didn't we think it let in a lot more light to the room? He was right. The oak panelling had struck us both as being wrong for this room, totally wrong. We enjoyed the rest of our visit, and the following year their leaflet popped through our letterbox. We came across a story relating to a strange and disturbing discovery at Grimsdyke Hall. It transpired that the water in the lake had been receding and causing concern. To rectify the damage it had been necessary to drain it completely during the dormant winter season. As a team of workmen were removing years of mud and silt, they made the shocking discovery of human remains. These were sent off to a pathology lab, and the police confirmed it was the body of Lady Violet Grimsdyke, who had supposedly run off one night with a groom. On later inspection his body was also found in the lake. The identification of the lady's remains was made easier by the large emerald ring that was still attached to the middle finger of her right hand. So I hadn't imagined it. There had not been a trick of the light after all. The lady in the portrait had been trying to tell us where her body had been brutally dumped so long ago. I wondered about the guide. Had he been real or just a very human-looking ghost? I rang the main office at Grimsdyke Hall and told the manager my strange tale. He listened without interruption as I mentioned both visits, and then said, in an accent that sounded old-fashioned and vaguely familiar, "Oh, very interesting, but you must be mistaken. We've never had a painting of Lady Violet hanging in the lower drawing room. There's never been wooden panelling in that room either. And as for the room guide, well, that room is the final one of the tour. We don't employ a guide, but just leave instruction boards illustrating special points of interest on various chairs and tables for visitors to pick up. However, we would very much like to use your story in our next promotion if you're willing to authenticate it, sir." It was then that I remembered where I'd first heard that voice. It was in the lower drawing room, and was the voice of the groom.